When missiles and drones fall, the damage is never only where they land. Pope Leo XIV made that clear at the end of his Wednesday general audience, after a new wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine. He said he was following the war with concern, especially because it had sharply intensified in recent days, and he placed himself close to those suffering from the attacks, including civilians. Then he said the line that carried the whole appeal: "War does not solve problems, it worsens them." That was not a diplomatic phrase. It was a judgment on the false promise that violence can build security. Pope Leo said war multiplies suffering and hatred, and wherever missiles and drones fall, hopes collapse too. Homes are destroyed. Places of worship are destroyed. Innocent lives are shattered. The Pope's strongest sentence was not aimed only at Ukraine's battlefield, it was aimed at the false promise behind every war. The general audience is one of the Pope's most public weekly moments. Pilgrims gather, languages change, blessings are given, and a teaching that begins inside St. Peter's Square or the Vatican Audience Hall often ends up speaking far beyond the people physically present. That is what happened at the audience on May 27th. Pope Leo XIV was not only addressing a crowd, he was placing the suffering of nations before the conscience of the Church. Ukraine stood at the center of the appeal because the war there had sharply intensified. That detail matters. The Pope was not speaking about violence in the abstract. He was responding to a new wave of Russian attacks, and he specifically included civilians among those suffering. In Catholic moral language, that is never a minor detail. Civilian life is not background damage. It is the place where war's claims about security are tested and exposed. Lebanon also entered the audience through Pope Leo's greetings to Lebanese pilgrims and to Arabic-speaking and French-speaking faithful. That connection gave the moment a wider frame. Ukraine and Lebanon are not the same story, and they do not carry the same history, but both reveal how quickly ordinary people become the ones who carry the weight of decisions made far above them. When the Pope speaks to wounded nations in the same audience, he is not pretending that all conflicts are identical. He is saying that human suffering cannot be treated as normal just because it has become familiar. That is why his turn to Mary mattered. Calling Mary the Queen of Peace is not a way of avoiding politics. It is a way of refusing to let politics have the final word over the wounded. For Catholics, Mary is the mother who stands close to the suffering body of Christ, and that makes her presence in a moment of war more than devotional language. It is the Church saying that people wounded by violence are not abandoned to the logic of violence. Then, Leo named the cost of war in a way that no military briefing can soften. Pope Leo's appeal began with a simple statement of attention. He said he was following the war in Ukraine with concern. That matters because papal concern is not the same thing as distant sympathy. When the Pope names a war publicly, especially during a general audience, he is telling the Church that this suffering belongs inside its prayer, its moral attention, and its public conscience. Then he made the appeal more specific. The war, he said, had sharply intensified in recent days. He was speaking after a new wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine, and he made sure to name the people most easily hidden inside the language of war: civilians. He expressed closeness to all those suffering because of the recent attacks, including those against civilians. That one phrase kept the focus from drifting into strategy alone. Behind every phrase like escalation or strike or retaliation, there are families whose lives are being rearranged by fear. Then Pope Leo said what every age of violence tries to deny: war does not solve problems, it worsens them. That sentence was the center of the appeal because it challenged the logic that keeps wars alive. War always claims that one more attack can create safety, that one more wave of force can bend reality into peace, that destruction can somehow become a foundation for order. Pope Leo rejected that logic directly. War, he said, does not build security. It multiplies suffering and hatred. Then came the image that made the appeal impossible to reduce to policy language: Wherever missiles and drones fall, he said, hopes also collapse. Homes are destroyed. Places of worship are destroyed. Innocent lives are shattered. That was the most important turn in the statement. He did not speak only about buildings, territory, or military damage. He spoke about hope. He spoke about the inner architecture of a people, the fragile belief that tomorrow can still be lived, prayed through, rebuilt, and handed to children without fear. The mention of places of worship carried its own weight. A church, a chapel, a synagogue, a mosque, or any house of prayer is not just another structure in a city. It is where people bring grief, vows, baptisms, funerals, silence, and thanksgiving. When war destroys places of worship, it does more than damage walls. It reaches for the places where a community remembers that it is more than a battlefield. After naming the wreckage, Pope Leo entrusted all peoples wounded by war to the protection of the Virgin Mary, Queen of Peace. That was not a soft ending after a hard statement. It was the Catholic shape of the appeal. First, name the evil without pretending it is normal. Then place the wounded before God through the mother who stands with suffering and refuses to let violence define the final word. And after naming the wreckage, Leo turned not to strategy, but to Mary. A world that grows used to war also grows used to lowering its expectations for peace. That is why Pope Leo's greetings to the Lebanese pilgrims belonged in the same moral field as his appeal for Ukraine. The article notes that new attacks had struck Lebanon too, and when Pope Leo addressed Arabic-speaking and French-speaking faithful, he did not give them a political analysis. He gave them a word of nearness through Mary. He said, Mary, our mother, is always present with us, praying for us and caring for us with maternal love. That language can sound gentle until it is heard in the middle of violence. Then it becomes something stronger. It tells people living under threat that they are not just a suffering population in a headline. They are sons and daughters seen by the Church, placed under the care of a mother, and blessed by the Lord against every evil. Pope Leo's words to the Lebanese faithful did not pretend that new attacks had disappeared. They insisted that violence does not get to define the whole horizon. Then, in the same audience, Pope Leo turned toward Poland and thanked mothers. That might seem like a separate subject, but inside this address it carried the same thread. War shatters innocent lives. Mothers receive and protect life at its beginning. The Pope recalled that Poland had celebrated Mother's Day the previous day, and he thanked mothers who generously passed on the gift of life, cared for their children, and taught them love for God and neighbor. That is not sentimental Catholic language. It is a vision of peace that begins long before treaties are signed. A society that wants peace has to learn how to honor life before it is powerful, before it is useful, before it can defend itself, and before it can speak for itself. That is why Pope Leo prayed that the Holy Mother of God would intercede for mothers, so that they might obtain the grace of a lasting bond with Jesus. Then came the most direct moral line in the Polish greeting. With Mary's help, Pope Leo urged Poles to protect in their homeland the life of every person from conception to natural death. That phrase reaches across the whole Catholic understanding of human dignity. The unborn child, the civilian under bombardment, the elderly person, the sick person, the mother carrying responsibility in silence, and the wounded nation are not separate categories of concern. They all stand under the same claim. Human life is not a possession to be accepted or discarded according to convenience, power, or fear. So the audience did not move randomly from Ukraine to Lebanon to Polish mothers. It moved through one Catholic argument. War destroys life. Mary stands near the wounded. Mothers carry life. Nations must protect life. And the Church has to say all of that even when the world has trained itself to treat some forms of destruction as unavoidable. That made the final blessing more than a polite ending. Pope Leo left the audience with blessings that moved across wounded places and ordinary homes. To the Lebanese faithful, he asked the Lord to bless them and protect them from every evil. To the Polish pilgrims, He gave his blessing after thanking mothers for the hidden work of giving life, caring for children, and teaching love for God and neighbor. And over all peoples wounded by war, he placed the protection of Mary, Queen of Peace. That was the image left standing after the missiles, drones, collapsed hopes, damaged homes, and places of worship. A pope naming the destruction plainly, then placing the wounded under the care of a mother. If this helped you understand what the Church is actually doing in the world, liking the video helps more people find this kind of Catholic coverage. Subscribe for more Catholic news, Vatican context, and stories from the living history of the Church. And tell me in the comments, what happens to a society when war is treated as a path to security, even after it has already multiplied suffering and hatred? The story continues, and so does the work.